Hello brothers and welcome to Sigma Old Man channel. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks in quietly and suddenly everyone else is exposed. Think about this. Psychologists have long noted that people who manipulate, dominate or crave attention often rely on others playing along. Their tricks only work if the target reacts exactly the way they expect. But what happens when they meet someone who doesn't react at all? Someone who won't bend, won't flinch and won't dance to their tune. That's when the show falls apart, and it's exactly why Sigma males always end up destroying a very particular kind of personality. In today's world, where fake depth, forced charm and noise often pass for power, the Sigma cuts through it like a blade. Not because he's trying to, but because his independence, silence and refusal to play by anyone else's script make entire personas collapse. And let's be honest, watching certain personality types squirm under that kind of quiet exposure is both fascinating and a little entertaining. You'll see it, the moment when someone who thrives on manipulation or constant attention realizes they're up against someone completely immune. It's not just a clash of personalities, it's a total dismantling, so buckle up, because we're diving into the one personality type that Sigma males always destroy. And trust me, by the end, you'll never look at that type the same way again. Number 1, the emotional blackmailer. The emotional blackmailer is one of the most toxic personality types you'll ever encounter, and Sigma males dismantle them without even trying. Emotional blackmail works on most people because it preys on guilt, sympathy, and the fear of being seen as uncaring. It's the person who sulks when you don't give them what they want, the one who exaggerates their pain to manipulate your choices, or the one who constantly hints that if you don't bend to their needs, you're cruel or heartless. This type thrives on making others feel like they owe them constant comfort, attention, or sacrifice. Most people fall into the trap because they don't want to look selfish, but a Sigma doesn't play that game. What makes a Sigma male dangerous to this type is his complete refusal to take responsibility for feelings that aren't his to carry. When someone tries to guilt trip him, he doesn't flinch. He sees the tactic for what it is, a way of controlling him without using reason or fairness. He doesn't engage in arguments about how he should feel, and he doesn't cave in just to restore peace. Instead, he withdraws his energy, and suddenly the emotional blackmailer has no stage to perform on. They're left holding their manipulative act with no audience, and nothing exposes weakness faster than a performance no one's watching. The emotional blackmailer expects people to fear disapproval. The Sigma doesn't. He doesn't need the validation of being seen as kind or accommodating, and because of that, he's immune. When he refuses to react, the blackmailer spirals because their entire power structure relies on people reacting exactly as planned. They want you to feel guilty, they want you to feel cornered. But when faced with someone who treats their theatrics like background noise, they crumble. What's brutal about this is that the Sigma doesn't destroy the emotional blackmailer with aggression. He does it with absence. No shouting, no retaliation, no defense. Just the kind of cold indifference that says, your feelings are yours, not mine to manage. That refusal is devastating to someone who survives by trapping others in responsibility for their moods. The Sigma exposes them for what they are, people who weaponize weakness to manipulate strength. And once their tactic fails, they're left powerless, humiliated, and forced to confront the fact that not everyone can be controlled. That's why Sigma males always destroy this type. They don't buy into emotional currency. They don't invest in guilt. And in a world where manipulation often works, their resistance feels like the one wall that never cracks. And number 2, the pretend deep type. The pretend deep type is everywhere. The person who sprinkles conversations with half-digested philosophy, motivational quotes, or borrowed lines from books they never actually read. They posture as wise, mysterious, or spiritually elevated. But it's all surface level. They survive on performance, using fancy words and rehearsed ideas to appear intelligent or profound. The problem is they've confused regurgitation with originality, and Sigma males see straight through that. A Sigma doesn't need to announce his depth. He doesn't post endless captions about energy, souls, or the universe aligning. He doesn't rehearse wisdom to look impressive. His silence, his way of observing, and his refusal to explain himself actually say more than the pretend deep person's entire monologue. This is where the destruction happens. Not because the Sigma calls them out publicly, but because his presence exposes the gap between their words and their reality. The pretend deep type needs validation. They need someone to nod, to admire their insight, to believe they've cracked some universal code. But when they speak around a Sigma, they don't get what they crave. The Sigma doesn't hand out cheap applause. He just listens, maybe nods once, and lets the emptiness of their act echo back at them. That silence makes them second-guess themselves, because deep down they know their depth is borrowed, not lived. What crushes the pretend deep type is that Sigmas actually live the things they talk about. A Sigma wrestles with solitude, struggles with meaning, studies patterns of people, and draws raw insight from lived experience, not hashtags. So when the shallow philosopher tries to impress, it comes across as shallow theater standing next to genuine substance. It's like trying to compare a puddle reflecting the sky with the ocean itself. The Sigma doesn't argue or expose them directly because he doesn't need to. The fraud is revealed simply by contrast. The more the pretend deep person talks, the more hollow they sound next to a Sigma's unspoken depth. That's the quiet devastation. They get destroyed not by confrontation, but by being measured against authenticity they can't imitate. And once that curtain drops, the pretend deep type is left scrambling, forced to realize their wisdom doesn't hold weight when real depth walks into the room and says nothing at all. Number 3, the opportunist. The opportunist is the type of person who treats loyalty and principles like seasonal clothing, something to put on when it's convenient and toss aside the moment it no longer fits their agenda. They're masters of jumping ship, chasing trends, and reshaping themselves depending on who's in the room or what advantage they can grab. At first glance, this adaptability can look like cleverness. They seem resourceful, always landing on their feet. But when a Sigma male shows up, the entire illusion crumbles, because a Sigma is the embodiment of consistency, and nothing exposes a chameleon faster than being placed next to a rock. Sigmas don't chase the crowd, they don't shift values with the wind, and they don't compromise themselves for temporary rewards. This unwavering independence is exactly what makes the opportunist look weak and hollow. When faced with a Sigma, the opportunist tricks get stripped bare. While they're busy contorting themselves to fit in or gain favor, the Sigma is unmoved, steady, and uninterested in whatever fleeting advantage is on the table. That contrast is brutal because it highlights just how spineless the opportunist really is. Opportunists rely on the fact that most people won't call them out. They thrive in environments where no one notices the small betrayals, the sudden shifts in loyalty, or the way they discard people once they've gotten what they wanted. But Sigmas notice. They see patterns, not performances. And once a Sigma clocks an opportunist behavior, it's game over. He doesn't confront them with theatrics. He simply disengages. That quiet dismissal is devastating because opportunists need access to people to exploit them. Without access, they're powerless. What truly destroys the opportunist is the Sigma's refusal to play short-term games. The opportunist always thinks in terms of what benefits me right now. But the Sigma is playing a longer, deeper game, one where self-respect, authenticity, and principle never get compromised. When those two approaches collide, the opportunist looks cheap, desperate, and small. They're exposed as people who don't stand for anything because standing for something would mean sometimes losing, and opportunists can't stomach that. At the end of the day, opportunists fear people like Sigmas because they can't bend them, can't use them, and can't lure them into shallow trades of self-respect for gain. The Sigma's consistency doesn't just wreck the opportunist, it erases their entire survival strategy. Number 4, the passive-aggressive. The passive-aggressive type is the kind of person who never fights you head-on but always tries to sting you sideways. They survive on sly digs, disguised insults, and backhanded compliments that are meant to undermine without ever being direct. They'll smile while throwing shade, act polite while dropping little verbal knives, and play innocent if they're called out. It's a strategy built on cowardice, taking shots while pretending they never fired them. Most people either laugh it off to keep the peace or get tangled in trying to decode the hidden meaning. That's exactly what keeps the passive-aggressive type in control. But when they meet a Sigma male, the entire game collapses. Sigmas don't waste energy decoding manipulative puzzles. They don't chase hidden meanings. If the jab is clear enough, the Sigma will call it out bluntly, exposing the cowardice behind it with one line of honesty that makes everyone in the room uncomfortable except him. That honesty is like ripping off a mask, forcing the passive-aggressive person to face their own weakness. The fact that they're too afraid to say what they really mean. And if the jab is subtle enough to fly under most people's radar, the Sigma doesn't bother playing detective. He doesn't react at all. He gives total indifference, no recognition, no visible irritation, no emotional payoff. For a passive-aggressive personality, that's fatal, because their entire strategy depends on getting a reaction. They want you to feel the sting, to wrestle with it, to either snap back or stew in silence. But when a Sigma shrugs it off like static in the background, the attack falls flat. Nothing is more humiliating to a sneaky aggressor than realizing their clever insult didn't even register as worth noticing. What makes this destruction brutal is the contrast. The Sigma's directness or indifference makes the passive-aggressive type look small and weak. Their so-called cleverness turns into obvious cowardice when it fails to land. And in front of others, the effect is amplified. The Sigma comes across as solid and unbothered, while the passive-aggressive one looks like a petty child throwing stones from behind a wall. The truth is, passive-aggressiveness only works on people afraid of confrontation. Sigma males are not. That's why they don't just resist it, they obliterate it, stripping it of its power until it looks pathetic. And once exposed, the passive-aggressive person has nothing left but the uncomfortable silence of their own weakness. Number 5, the manipulative puppet master. The manipulative puppet master is the type who believes they can pull strings behind the scenes and make people dance without realizing it. They thrive on psychological games, subtle persuasion, guilt trips, pressure tactics, or dangling rewards to get others to act in ways that serve their agenda. Most people fall into their traps because the manipulation feels invisible at first, disguised as concern, guidance, or even kindness. But a Sigma male is the one person this type can't dominate because Sigmas don't respond to invisible strings. They notice the hands trying to pull them before the first tug even begins. What destroys the puppet master is that Sigmas don't just resist manipulation, they decode it. While most people get wrapped in the game, a Sigma sees patterns. He notices the timing of certain requests, the emotional hooks planted in conversations, the little power moves hidden under helpful advice. To him, the manipulation is less of a trap and more of a puzzle, and once he solves it, the game is over. The manipulator is exposed, not because the Sigma makes a dramatic confrontation, but because he quietly refuses to play along. This drives the puppet master insane. Their power relies on people taking the bait, reacting as expected, and moving according to the strings. When faced with someone who doesn't flinch, doesn't react, and doesn't follow the script, their entire strategy collapses. They tug harder, try new tricks, exaggerate the stakes, but the Sigma just watches, detached, as if studying a failed experiment. That detachment cuts deeper than any verbal rejection because it forces the manipulator to face their own impotence. The Sigma's independence is the final nail in the coffin. Puppet masters prey on dependency. They manipulate those who need approval, protection, or belonging. But the Sigma doesn't need any of that. He isn't afraid of walking alone, and that makes him immune to the leverage manipulators usually exploit. When there's nothing to hold over him, no hidden fear to weaponize, the puppet master is left exposed as powerless. In the end, the Sigma doesn't destroy the manipulative puppet master with force. He destroys them with clarity. By seeing the game for what it is and refusing to move, he makes the manipulator look like a child yanking at strings tied to nothing. And there's nothing more humiliating to a control freak than realizing their control doesn't exist. Number 6, the borrowed identity type. The borrowed identity type is the person who has no real center of their own, so they latch onto whatever looks powerful, admired, or respected in others. They study confidence in one person, style in another, values in someone else, and then patchwork those traits together like a costume. To the untrained eye, they can pass as impressive for a while, because surface-level confidence and borrowed charm can fool people who don't look too closely. But a Sigma male doesn't just see surfaces, he sees the seams, the copy and paste stitching, the lack of originality underneath the act. What destroys this type is how brutally the Sigma highlights authenticity without even trying. Sigmas are self-sufficient, carved from their own principles and experiences, not borrowed from others. They don't chase trends, they don't mimic behaviors, and they don't bend themselves to match the crowd. When they walk into the same space as the mimic, the contrast is undeniable. One radiates a grounded, unshakable presence, while the other looks like a cheap knockoff trying to keep up. And nothing humiliates the borrowed identity more than standing next to the real thing. The mimic thrives only when people mistake imitation for substance. But around a Sigma, they're stripped bare because Sigmas don't validate hollow performances. They don't clap for borrowed values or get impressed by staged confidence. They see past the mask immediately, and their refusal to acknowledge the act is devastating. Without external validation, the borrowed identity type is forced to confront the emptiness they've been covering up with stolen traits. The worst part for this personality is that Sigmas don't even need to call them out. They don't expose the mimic verbally or humiliate them in front of others. The destruction is silent. The Sigma's authenticity is so undeniable that the borrowed version looks painfully obvious, just by existing alongside it. It's like holding a forged signature next to the original. The flaws glare without needing explanation. And because Sigmas move through life on their own terms, without leaning on borrowed images, the mimic is left realizing the truth. They are dependent, fragile, and forgettable. The Sigma doesn't just outshine them, he erases their illusion entirely, leaving them exposed as nothing more than a bad photocopy of someone else's life. Number 7, the overexplainer. The overexplainer is the type who tries to dominate by drowning others in words. They talk in circles, pile on unnecessary details, and weaponize long-winded explanations to exhaust whoever is listening. It's less about clarity and more about control. They believe if they keep talking, they can corner people into submission or make themselves sound smarter than they really are. Their strategy relies on overwhelming the room, making others too tired to challenge them. Most people either tune out or nod along just to escape the verbal avalanche, but a Sigma male doesn't play that role. Sigmas are economical with words. They don't speak to fill silence or to impress people with verbal gymnastics. When they talk, every word carries weight, and that alone dismantles the overexplainer. One precise, direct sentence from a Sigma can cut through an entire 10-minute ramble, exposing the noise for what it is. An attempt to mask insecurity with volume. While the overexplainer is trying to build a fortress out of words, the Sigma demolishes it with a single line that gets straight to the point. This is humiliating for the overexplainer because their entire power move depends on people being too intimidated or too drained to respond. But the Sigma doesn't waste energy on wading through the swamp of unnecessary details. He listens just long enough to see the angle, then responds with something so sharp and concise, it makes the other person's words collapse under their own weight. It's like a scalpel cutting through a tangled mess, clean, effortless, undeniable. The silence Sigmas carry is also lethal here. Overexplainers thrive on filling space, but when they face someone who doesn't rush to match their noise, the imbalance becomes obvious. The Sigma's quiet makes the other person's rambling look desperate, like a nervous attempt to prove worth, and once the contrast is visible, the overexplainer loses credibility. What was meant to sound like dominance now sounds like insecurity on loudspeaker. What really destroys this type is the realization that all their talking achieves nothing against someone who doesn't need to win with words. Sigmas don't feel the need to prove themselves verbally, and that refusal strips the overexplainer of their only weapon. Their paragraphs get reduced to background noise, while the Sigma's single line carries all the authority in the room. That's why overexplainers crumble in the presence of Sigmas. They learn the hard way that power isn't in the most words spoken, but in the few words that actually matter. Number 8, the energy leech. The energy leech is the kind of person who can't function without attaching themselves to someone else's emotions. They thrive on gossip, chaos, and unnecessary drama because it gives them a sense of control and keeps them at the center of attention. They poke, prod, and stir the pot, not because they care about the outcome, but because they need the reaction. Every sigh, every emotional response, every spark of anger or sympathy is fuel that keeps them alive. Most people eventually give in, either by arguing, comforting, or feeding into the spectacle, because the pressure of constant drama is exhausting. That's how the energy leech wins. But the Sigma male dismantles this type without effort, because he refuses to give them what they crave. He doesn't pour out reactions. He doesn't rise to bait. He doesn't take the hook, no matter how tempting the drama seems. Instead, he starves them of fuel completely, and for an energy leech, that's fatal. When their antics are met with silence or a calm indifference, they shrivel. They lose their stage, their audience, and their sense of control. Nothing kills an energy leech faster than realizing they can't drain someone who generates their own power. What makes this destruction brutal is that it's not loud, it's slow and suffocating. The energy leech expects a fight, expects tears, expects someone to get pulled into their mess. But when a Sigma stands there unbothered, not investing even a drop of energy, the leech implodes. Their drama looks pointless, their gossip looks petty, and their entire identity as a chaos feeder starts to collapse. Other people eventually notice it too. The leech isn't powerful, they're just parasitic. And next to a Sigma's grounded energy, that parasitism looks embarrassing. The real sting comes from the Sigma's self-sufficiency. He doesn't need people to regulate his mood, and he won't allow anyone else to regulate his. That makes him untouchable to the energy leech, because they only know how to operate through dependency. When there's no dependency to exploit, they're left flailing, like a parasite cut off from its host. In the end, a Sigma doesn't destroy the energy leech with confrontation. He destroys them with absence. By giving them nothing, he forces them to face the emptiness of their own existence. And for a personality that survives on feeding from others, there's no harsher end than starving to death on their own drama. Number 9, the noisemaker. The noisemaker is the type who confuses volume with power. They walk into rooms believing that the loudest voice wins, that if they talk over everyone, laugh the hardest, or exaggerate the most, they'll automatically dominate. On the surface, their energy can look commanding, but underneath, it's desperation disguised as confidence. They aren't loud because they're strong. They're loud because they're afraid of being overlooked. Most people either give them attention to keep the peace or retreat just to escape the chaos. That's how the noisemaker convinces themselves they're in control. But when a Sigma male enters the space, the dynamic changes instantly. Sigmas don't compete for attention with noise, they dismantle it with silence. They don't raise their voice, they don't try to outshine the chaos, they don't play the game at all. Instead, they sit still, say little, and let presence speak louder than shouting ever could. That's where the destruction happens. Suddenly, the noisemaker's volume looks like insecurity on blast, while the Sigma's quiet confidence becomes magnetic. Silence is uncomfortable for people who depend on noise because it exposes the weakness they're trying to cover. When the Sigma refuses to engage, the noisemaker starts to unravel. They'll push harder, talking louder, cracking bigger jokes, exaggerating even more. But the more they do, the more it looks like desperation next to the Sigma's calm. Eventually, people's attention shifts, not because the Sigma demanded it, but because his silence creates a gravity that pulls focus away from the chaos. Nothing humiliates the noisemaker more than realizing people are paying more attention to someone who hasn't even spoken. What really destroys them is that Sigmas prove volume isn't power. It's often insecurity disguised as presence. The Sigma embodies control, the kind of quiet authority that doesn't need to be broadcast. And that contrast leaves the noisemaker exposed as a performer rather than a leader. Their biggest weapon, volume, suddenly looks like a cheap trick. In the end, the noisemaker can't stand in a Sigma's presence because their entire identity is built on filling silence, and the Sigma shows them that silence, when owned, is far more powerful. The lesson is brutal. Real presence doesn't need noise, and when silence commands the room, shouting becomes nothing more than background static. Number 10, the group-dependent bully. The group-dependent bully is never truly strong. They just know how to hide inside numbers. Alone, they're hesitant, unsure, and often spineless. But when surrounded by a clique, they transform into a loud, aggressive version of themselves. They draw courage from the pack, use others as shields, and thrive on the illusion of dominance created by group pressure. Their entire strategy is built on the belief that no one will ever call them out one-on-one. And for a while it works. People avoid conflict because they don't want to face the whole pack at once. But a Sigma male dismantles this type without even lifting a finger. Sigmas don't move in packs. They aren't fueled by group approval or validation. They stand alone, and that independence shines a harsh light on the bully's dependence. Suddenly, the contrast is undeniable. One man grounded in his own strength, and another whose courage evaporates the moment his backup isn't there. The Sigma doesn't have to say much. His very presence exposes the cowardice. Group-dependent bullies are terrified of this kind of person because they can't manipulate or intimidate him into submission. A Sigma doesn't bend to peer pressure, doesn't care about being liked, and doesn't get rattled by group theatrics. He'll stare down the entire pack with the same calm indifference he would if it were just one person. That unshaken composure strips the bully of their power because their entire performance relies on the fear of numbers. When that fear doesn't work, the act looks weak, even laughable. What makes it even more brutal is how the Sigma's independence dismantles the bully's image in front of others. The bully's clique often follows out of habit, not respect. But when they see someone who stands calmly, unbothered and unaffected, it cracks the illusion. The bully doesn't look like a leader anymore. They look exposed, like a child hiding behind their friends. That loss of credibility is worse than confrontation because it reveals to everyone that the so-called power they project is nothing more than borrowed courage. In the end, the Sigma doesn't just resist the group-dependent bully. He nullifies them. He shows that true strength isn't loud and it isn't in numbers. It's in the ability to stand alone, unmoved. And once that contrast is clear, the bully is stripped bare, revealed not as dominant but as desperate, an insecure follower pretending to lead. Number 11, the guilt tripper. The guilt tripper is the kind of person who treats emotions like chains. They survive by making others feel responsible for their moods, constantly using phrases like, "After everything I've done for you," or "If you cared, you'd," to trap people into compliance. Their entire power lies in flipping the script, turning their disappointment or sadness into someone else's burden. Most people fold under this pressure because no one likes being painted as the villain, and the guilt tripper knows it. They use shame as currency, controlling others without ever having to raise their voice. But this game collapses the second it hits a Sigma male. Sigmas don't carry guilt that isn't theirs. They don't internalize moods that don't belong to them, and they refuse to let someone else's emotions become their leash. When a guilt tripper tries to corner them, they don't argue, explain, or defend themselves. They simply don't flinch. That refusal is devastating because guilt tripping only works when the other person reacts. Without the reaction, the weapon turns into dead weight. What destroys the guilt tripper most is how effortlessly the Sigma's indifference highlights the weakness of the tactic. While others are scrambling to appease, the Sigma calmly holds his ground, and the guilt tripper is left exposed as manipulative rather than hurt. Their attempt at emotional control looks less like sensitivity and more like a strategy of weakness, and nothing undermines their power faster than people realizing their sadness was just bait. The Sigma's strength lies in boundaries. He knows where he ends and another person begins. That clear line makes him untouchable to guilt trippers, who rely on blurred boundaries to trap people in responsibility for their feelings. The Sigma doesn't get tangled because he sees the tactic for what it is, an attempt to shift accountability, and instead of explaining or defending, he just refuses to play. The result is brutal. The guilt tripper loses their only weapon, their manipulation bounces back on them, and their vulnerability looks hollow. Around others, the Sigma's calm detachment makes the guilt tripper seem melodramatic and manipulative, stripping away the mask of innocence they usually hide behind. In the end, the guilt tripper isn't just resisted by a Sigma, they're dismantled. Their strongest weapon, guilt, turns useless, because you can't change someone who doesn't accept the links. And for a manipulator who survives on control, there's nothing more humiliating than realizing their power has no effect. Number 12, the spotlight addict. The spotlight addict is fueled by one thing, attention. They crave it, chase it, and panic when it slips from their grasp. Every move they make, whether it's exaggerating stories, forcing humor, showing off achievements, or even stirring drama, is designed to keep all eyes on them. The moment the attention shifts, they unravel because without it they feel irrelevant. For them, invisibility is death. Most people feed into this need, giving them space to shine just to avoid the tantrums, the sulking, or the exhausting theatrics that follow when they feel ignored. But when a Sigma male enters the scene, the spotlight addict meets their worst nightmare. Sigmas don't chase attention, they attract it. They don't demand the room's focus, yet somehow it always drifts toward them. Their silence, their composure, their self-possession, all of it has a gravitational pull that steals focus without effort. Suddenly the spotlight addict isn't the brightest presence in the room anymore. They're standing under a dim light, trying desperately to compete with someone who isn't even trying. And that quiet takeover is what destroys them. What makes the Sigma lethal to this type is his indifference. He doesn't even notice, let alone compete, for the attention that addicts crave. That makes it worse. If he fought for it, at least it would validate the addict's importance. But when he effortlessly pulls the room's focus without seeking it, he exposes the addict's desperation. Their loudness looks like insecurity, their showboating looks hollow, and their need for validation becomes painfully obvious. The crowd starts to see the difference between someone who needs attention to exist and someone whose presence naturally commands it. This contrast is humiliating for the spotlight addict because it highlights the fragility of their entire identity. They live for applause, for reactions, for recognition. The Sigma lives for none of it, and yet he receives it anyway. That imbalance forces the addict to confront the ugly truth. Attention isn't earned by begging for it, it's earned by being someone worth noticing. In the end, the spotlight addict can't survive in a Sigma's orbit. Their tricks stop working, their panic grows, and their invisibility gnaws at them. Meanwhile, the Sigma remains unbothered, proving that true presence doesn't need a spotlight. It is the spotlight. And nothing is more devastating to an addict than realizing their drug belongs to someone who never even asked for it. At the end of the day, Sigma males don't destroy people with force, aggression, or theatrics. They dismantle them with presence. Every personality type we've covered, whether it's the manipulator, the spotlight addict, the guilt tripper, or the group-dependent bully, crumbles not because the Sigma fights them, but because he refuses to play their games. His independence, his silence, his consistency, and his unshakable self-possession expose what others are trying so hard to hide: insecurity, weakness, and fakery. That's why the Sigma is so dangerous. He doesn't compete, he doesn't bend, and he doesn't get pulled into shallow power struggles. He simply stands firm, and by doing so, he forces masks to fall off. And that's the real truth. When pretenders, manipulators, and opportunists meet someone who can't be bought, fooled, or controlled, their whole identity collapses. The Sigma doesn't just survive these encounters, he turns them inside out. That's why he's always a quiet threat to personalities built on noise, performance, and dependency. If you found value in this breakdown and want more brutally honest insights into the Sigma mindset, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to like this video, drop a comment with your thoughts, and share it with others who will appreciate these raw truths. Your support helps us keep delivering content that cuts deeper than clichés.